Okay, Be'ezus Hashem. Today's daf is Masechta Baba Metzia daf Pei Tes. We're going to begin from daf Pei Ches Amid Beis, about 4 lines where it gets wide. So let's just review the topics that we're discussing over here. In the Chumash, it says, as you can see on your screen, Ki sovai bekem re'acha, if you're working in your friend's vineyard, let's say you're a worker there, v'chalta anavim kenafshecha ksovecha, you can eat many grapes as you want until you are full. But you don't put in anything into your basket. You have to just eat on the job. So the Torah gives you a worker permission to eat on the job. Then the Torah tells you that kisovai b'komas re'acha, same idea. If you're going into your friend's field, v'kotafta melilas biyadecha, and you're cutting ears of grain in your hand, so that you're permitted to do. So you're working, harvesting the grain, harvesting the wheat. But you're not allowed to put a sickle and take a lot of grain and then use that. Whatever you pick, that you can eat. And then the Torah, we have another pasuk, you're not allowed to muzzle an ox while it's threshing. So the Torah basically says that when an ox works for you, and it's dealing with you're not allowed to muzzle it. And same idea is you're not allowed to prevent it from eating. So if you have a worker working in your field, you're also not allowed to prevent him from eating. But if you notice, the examples by the worker is that he's helping pick fruits off or cut the grain from his friend's field. How would I know that a worker that's working in cut grapes or already harvested apples, he's washing the apples so that the owner can sell the apples? So how do you know at that point the worker is allowed to eat from those apples? The Torah only gives you an example of bekomas re'acha, when it's still standing. And then the opposite question that the Gemara is dealing with right now is that you tell me an ox you should not be muzzled or prevented from eating while it's threshing an animal. How do I know that an ox is not allowed to be muzzled when the produce is connected to the ground? Let's say the ox is helping harvest the grain. You're also not allowed to muzzle it. It's not just by when he's threshing. So this is the subject of today's daf, and then we'll go on to another topic. So the Gemara says like this: Ve'ela, again, I pay chesam at base, about where the lines get wide. Okay. Ve'ela. Ve'ela adam here I am. Ve'ela adam betolish minalan. How do I know that an adam is not allowed to be prevented when you're dealing with cut grain, cut grass, cut fruit, cut grain? How do you know you're not allowed to prevent the worker from eating? And says the Gemara, Amakra, the pasuk says, Kama, Beis Pamit. The Torah tells you Kama twice. In the second pasuk, it says, Kisave bekomas riacha, v'chemesh komas riacha. So it says it twice in that pasuk. If I don't need it to teach you that a human being is allowed to eat when the grain is connected to the ground, when the grapes are connected to the vine. It teaches you by an adam, with disconnected produce, it's also allowed to eat. So if the worker is just washing the apples that were already pre-cut, he's allowed to take from those apples. So that's the source. Rabami says, adam b'tolish leitzarach kra. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that a human being, a human worker, can eat when it's disconnected, when it's tolish, disconnected from its source. I don't need a pasuk that the worker can eat it, because kesiv, it's pasuk gives you the example, ki sovoi bekerem re'acha, when you're coming in to work in the vineyard are your friend. It doesn't say you're cutting the grapes. Milo yaskinen shesochri lekate, that you were hired to shoulder and carry grapes that were already pre-cut. V'amar Rachman, the Torah says leichel, that the worker is allowed to eat. So I know for a fact that a worker could eat but tolush, when things are already cut. Now the question is, shar b'mekuber minolan. How do I know an ox is allowed to eat when the grains and when the food that he's working with are connected to the ground? Kal v'chaymer, so the Gemara says, ma adam. I have a kal v'chaymer from adam. Ma adam, just like by a human being. She'eina oichel b'talish, that it doesn't eat when it's disconnected to the ground. It doesn't mean, we just said that the Adam does eat when it's disconnected ground, but it's not really clear in the pasuk. You have to have a dre in the pasuk to figure it out that an Adam would eat betalish. So it's not really clear that an Adam does eat betalish. So we'll assume that for the Kal V'chomer that he doesn't. But a worker is allowed to eat when it's connected to the ground. Shar that eats betalish, that from disconnected from the ground, because and that's when it's disconnected from the ground. Certainly it should be able to eat when it's working, when the ox is working with produce that are connected to the ground. So that's the Gemara. The Gemara wants to make that kal v'chayma. So the Gemara says, the reason why an Adam can go strict and allow a worker to eat betalish, to eat b'mechubar, is because it's a mitzvah when the Adam, a human being, is a mitzvah to give him tzedakah. So it's a mitzvah to make sure that he stays alive. A shar, you don't have a mitzvah to make sure a shar stays alive. There's no chiyuv to let a shar survive. So maybe the only heter, the only leniency for an ox to eat is only if it's betalish, not mechubar food. So the Gemara asks, well, let's make it an attempt to say that the Eishar mitzuva lahachyoisim kal v'chomer. Maybe there will be an obligation to make sure a ox lives because of a kal v'chomer. In other words, we're going to have a mitzvah not to kill an ox, only if you're eating it. But if other than that, you have to make sure that the ox stays alive, and you have to, pay for its doctor bills. Because ma adam, you'll make a kal v'chomer from adam. Ma adam shiatem mitzuva al chesimasai. There's no issa to muzzle a worker. You have to allow him to eat the food, but the Torah didn't give you. If the boss makes the worker put on a mask, he doesn't get malchus. The boss does not get malchus on that. But with regard to a human being, you have an obligation to keep him alive. Shar, an ox that you're commanded, make sure that you're not allowed to put a mask, a muzzle on the ox, and if you do so, you get a big lav, a malchus. So certainly there will be a mitzvah to make sure to keep the ox alive. So how do you know that there's no mitzvah to keep the ox alive? You don't have to take it to a doctor if you see the shar is sick. Because the pasuk says, "V'chei achicha imach." You have to make sure your brother lives with you. So it's a brother that you have to keep alive, another human being. Achicha v'lo shar. Only a brother, you have the mitzvah of tzedakah, of gemilas chesed, but not with a shar. There's no mitzvah of gemilas chesed with an ox. So now we're back to square one. How do I know an ox is permitted to eat, and you're not allowed to muzzle an ox when he's dealing with mechuber food, when he's working with grains that are connected to the ground? Al-Makrab, the pasuk says, Reyacha based palmim. So there's pasuk by over here, it says, Komas Reyacha, and Komas Reyacha, it says the word Reyacha twice. So we have drushes from that even a shar has is permitted, and not only that permitted, but you have a lav not to muzzle a shar, even when it's dealing with stuff that are mechuber to the ground. Ravina says like this: I don't need a pasuk to teach you an adam disconnecting from the ground, a shar that's connected to the ground, a pasuk to teach me they're allowed to eat. The Torah says Torah says clearly, don't muzzle an ox when it's threshing. Obviously, now we go to Amid Aleph, pay test Amid Aleph. Michti, let us see. Kol mili yisnai b'chasima. Every animal you're not allowed to muzzle any animal. The ox is just an example. You can't muzzle a bear or whatever animal that you're working with, or goat. The Alfina Shar Shar Shabbos, we learned Shar from Shabbos, that whenever the Torah writes ox, it's just an example, but it really means that you're not allowed to muzzle any animal. So then the word ox becomes extra, because in Kain Lichter Rachmona, the Torah just should write simply, Loi Todish B'chasima. Don't thresh by muzzling the animal that you're working with. Shar, the Kasar Rachmana Lamali. Why did the Torah write the word shar? Why did the Torah single out the ox? So the Torah singled out the ox, la kushe, because the Torah wanted you to make an example to compare. The Torah wanted you to say, Choisem, the one that's doing the muzzling, lenechsam, to the one that is being muzzled. The nechsam, the one that's being muzzled, lechoisem, is compared, juxtaposed to the one that's doing the muzzling. So this is how we're going to drarshan. Ma choisem oichel b'mechubar, just like a choisem, when you muzzle an animal, it eats b'mechubar. Af nechsam oichel b'mechubar. So also the animal can eat b'mechubar, just like the owner can eat b'mechubar if it's connected to the ground and he owns the field. So even the thing that you're working with can eat when it's connected to the ground. Uma nechsam, and just like the animal can eat oichel b'talish, can eat the food that's disconnected from the ground, because that's loisachsam shor b'dishoy av choisem. So if you're dealing with a human worker, oichel b'talish will eat even stuff that are disconnected from the ground. So let's just sum it up. The answer is that the Torah tells you that by an animal and by a human being, you're not allowed to muzzle them, basically. If you have a worker that's working for you, you have to allow them to eat when they're working for you. And it doesn't matter what they're working for you, what kind of produce they're working with you, whether it's talush, disconnected fruits that have been already disconnected from the tree, or if it's fruits that are connected from the tree. In both instances, by both the animal and by the human being, you're not allowed to muzzle them and stop them from eating. Now we go to new brises and halachas. You would think that if you let's say you work in other areas, you have to allow the worker to eat. Let's say you're making potato kugel. So it's not true. Tanar Rabbanan, rabbis taught dayish. Right, the Torah says threshing, that it's dealing with something that grows from the ground, and the worker can eat from it. Only types of food that the worker is working for produce that grows to the ground, then the worker can eat it. So this excludes that if you're making cheese, because it has nothing to do with something growing from the ground. If you hire a worker to help you make cheese and butter, there ain't a pile oichelbai. The worker will not be allowed to eat from the cheese, because it's not the example that the Torah gave. The Torah gave an example of actual food that grows from the ground, not cheese. Says the Gemara, Lomali, what do I need that pasuk for? The Torah's example is that your worker goes into the vineyard and your friend. So what do I need this pasuk of dayish? So the Gemara says, I need. I would have thought, since we use kama to be marba, any type of standing grain, right? Any type of grain, but so I might think it's an all-inclusive thing. It's anytime you hire a worker, the Torah is going to say that you have to allow them to eat. Right? You're in a restaurant. You hire a worker. The Torah is telling you have to allow them to eat. Kamash Blam, that's not so. It's only if you hire a worker to help you cut the fruits of your tree or harvest your grain, then you'll have to allow them to eat min Torah, but not anything else that has not related to gedule karka of something that grows from the ground. Tanya Idach, we learned in another brisa. Dayish, ma dayish miyuchad davish gemar malacha poil oichabay. That means that the only time the work is allowed to is only if this is the final act of this item. But like threshing is the final act, so now it becomes edible to eat, or at least you can munch on it because you got rid of the psilus, the unedible stuff, or you're cutting it off the ground. But yotza, this excludes hamanakish besumim of tzolim. If you're plucking garlic or onions, hoyel, if you're plucking the bad garlic and onions, right? You're plucking them, but you're going to let the garlics that remain and the onions that remain grow full. Hoyel ve'engamar mocha. That is not the final step in this onion field, right? It's something else. The worker would not eat. So again, if I hire a worker to water my field, right, to water my strawberry patch, he can't pick a strawberry and eat it because that's not the gemar malacha. I'm still waiting to harvest these strawberries. So therefore, the worker will not be allowed to eat. Says the Gemara, Lomali, what do I need this pasuk dayish? We learn it from that the Torah tells you that if you're doing something, putting it into the basket of the owner, the Torah says you're allowed to eat, but don't put it in your basket. So the Torah already implies that this leniency of a worker could eat, and it's not gezela, right? Is only if he's actually doing something that is the Gemar Malacha, harvesting. So what do I need the pasuk dayish to teach you that? And so like tzricha afagav the komashal kitni bebein alime. Sometimes you're getting rid of the small ones from the larger ones. In other words, we're talking about a worker that's getting rid of the unripened onions, let's say, and to make room so that the big onions grow and ripen well. And he's taking the unripened onions and putting it in the basket of his owner. So, but this is not the Gemar Malacha because he's going to come back and harvest the big onions. So you might think during that period, he would be allowed to eat because he's actually supplying some of the onions, the small onions, into the basket of the owner. Kamash Malon, since it's not the final work being done on this onion patch, and therefore the worker would not be allowed to eat. Tanya Idach. So it's very limited when the worker could eat from the produce. Another thing. Tanya Idach, Daesh, Ma Daesh, Miyuchad Davish, like Nigmar Lachli, Lamaisa, Payal Eichabai, Avkol, Shaloi Nigmar Lachli, Lamaisa, Payal Eichabai. That means that as long as there's no chi of maisrus on the stuff that you're working with, then the worker could eat. But if already you pass the chi of maisrus on this item, then the worker cannot eat. For example, let's say you have regular ripened grapes that are stuck to dried grapes, right? And you're trying to separate them out. So they were already chayev b'maisrus, because let's say they're in your house and you're just separating them out. You need extra help there. So it already had gemar malacha. You already finished it. It already is chayev b'maisrus. So you hire a worker to help you out to separate the tamarim, the dates, from the dried figs, so dried dates. So then it already finished the malacha, and so therefore ein hapayal eichabai. The payal cannot work in that capacity and take some of the dates for himself. It's not allowed to. Already had chi of maisrus. Then Vatanya says Gemara. I'll ask you a question. Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa, habayda betrarim gregris payal eichabai. If you do work in tamarim and gregris, the worker can eat. So how do you square off that, which you just told me that if you baidel tamarim and gregris, ain't a payal eichabai? Answers the Gemara. Amar Papa kitanihi b'tarich lone. That's talking about a certain type of bad dates that don't get ripened on the tree, and you put them into a basket made of date leaves, and therefore it already didn't have that type that price is talking about tamarim and gregris that were not mechuyev and maisrus. Okay, so we learned another thing, that once a fruit has a chi of maiser on it, if you hire a worker to help you do something with that fruit, then you cannot. The worker has no right to eat any of that produce. So again, if you bring fruit into your house, right, and then you hire a worker to help you like clean it or whatever, so then the worker cannot eat from that fruit, because once you bring it into your house, you already chayiv maisrus on it. Tanya idach, we learned in a brisa. Dayesh my dayesh davash le'nigmer lach melechal poyel oichabai. I've called davash le'nigmer lach lechal poyel oichabai. Yatsa losh makata ba'oifish nigmer lach lechal the ena poyel oichabai. Here's another step. Another step means that if I hire a worker and he's helping me knead a dough, so since once you already started to knead a dough, there's a chi of challah over here, then the worker cannot eat from that dough. So that's what it says. But let's say, helping you schlep water to pour it onto the flour to make the dough, then the worker, that's prior to the chi of challah, and therefore the worker could eat from that flour. Says the Gemara, but that flour already had gemar malacha for meiser. You already had meiser on that wheat flour. So how is it that you're telling me that the worker is allowed to eat? You just told me that once it passes the time period that there's an obligation to give meiser from this produce, from this flour, the worker can't eat it. But you're telling me there's a step after that called challah. Answers the Gemara, like kasha, it's not difficult. That Bryce is talking about where you're not giving off meiser at all because it's outside Israel, and outside Israel there's no chi of meisers. Says the Gemara, if that Bryce is talking about there is no meisers, then there is no chala either, because chala is dependent on Eretz Yisrael as well. Talking about it's in Eretz Yisrael, but like kasha, and it's not difficult. We're dealing with a period of time where there's no such a thing of giving off meiser, but there will be a din of giving off chala. When was that? All the time. There's a chi of meisers, and there's also chi of chala. Not all the time. In the first 14 years of when they first went into Eretz Yisrael, right away there was a chi of chala, but until they really settled the land, there was no chi of a meisris. So during that period of time, they were chayiv and chala and not chayiv and meisris. So that's why the second brisa gives you the time cutoff period of when a worker can eat from the produce is only before the chi of chala sets in. Because that Bryce is talking about a situation with people where the first 14 years of our taking over Eretz Yisrael, we did not give off Meiser. So the Gemara asks the question, Mida Meiser Kagarim? Does this have anything to do with Meisers? Gemara Malacha Kagarim. It's to finish the final work. And once you finish the final work, the Torah doesn't say, when there's a chi of Meisers, the worker can't eat anymore. The Torah just says that if this is the final work that you're going to do with this produce, in harvesting, that's when the worker can eat. Beyond that, the worker can't eat. So how is a situation where we allow a worker to eat from the wheat flour prior to kneading it? Once already you made it into flour, certainly it passed the final work that had to be done with that wheat. Ella Amaravina, the answer is kroich v'toni, you have to combine it. That really, on food that only you're going to give meiser on, then meiser is the cutoff point. But a food that, like wheat, that there's a meiserus and chala, then we go after the second cutoff point, which is chala, and the worker could eat up until the point where this produce is, with this wheat flour is chayiv and chala, and that's what it says. It doesn't. It depends. Some produce, the item, the cutoff point is meiser, and for some the cutoff point is chala. We just take the later of the two. So let's say figs, you're not going to have a challah cutoff point, so the meiser is the cutoff point. With the worker beyond the chiyuv, once the meiser kicks in, the worker can't take any of the food anymore. And for wheat, if you're going to make it into a bread, then the worker could eat as working with you up until the period of time where there'll be chiyuv challah on this dough. New Gemara. We just said before that a worker cannot just like fress, on the job and eat as much as he can. And not only that, he's not allowed to add a relish on it so that he can eat more of the food. He can eat more of the grapes that he's working with you. Let's see. A worker. Can he roast it in fire, whatever, let's say a bitter fruit that he's working with, and eat it? But because he's roasting it, he's making it sweeter, so now he's going to eat more. Is it like what we said? You can't eat grapes dipped in a dip. Why? Because that will cause you to eat more grapes. And the Torah says you can eat grapes, but I don't allow you to put relish on it. So is it similar to that? Therefore, you cannot, roast it in fire, or maybe not. Maybe since you're just dealing with the food itself and you're not adding a condiment on it, you're permitted to roast in the fire. Tashma, come in here. The owner can give his workers wine so that they're not going to eat a lot of grapes. He can feed them up and fill them up so they're not going to have an appetite to eat grapes when they're working. And Rishoyim Pa'al in the Talmud Metzia, a worker can dip his bread in brine, so he'll have an appetite to eat a lot of grapes. So therefore, we see that a worker can do something to bring upon his appetite, so he'll eat more. So presumably, roasting a bitter fruit in fire would be permitted. That's what the Gemara says now. So the Gemara says we go to Amabase, Lachshuri Gav to make the person himself able to eat and have a bigger appetite, certainly that could be done because you're not playing with the food itself. Our question is lachshure pere. Can you can you can you make the fruit better by roasting it? What would be the din like that? So Tashma come in here. A worker can eat the grapes that are on top of the rows. The top of each row of vines has the best grapes. Ulavad, the Brisa says he cannot roast it in fire, so to make it sweeter. So we see clearly that you're not allowed to do that. So here's a clear Brisa that says you're not allowed to do that. So the Gemara says not true. The reason why he's not allowed to roast in fire because that takes up time while he's working. He's being paid per hour to work for the owner, so he can't take off time to roast it in fire. But our question is, let's say his wife and kids are helping him out in the field. Can they light it up in fire so that they'll sweeten the grape so that he'll be able to eat more? That's the question. And he's not going to have any waste of time on his job. What would be the din like that? Okay, so now we'll stop in 2 minutes. Tashma, come in here. So the Bryce, you're not allowed to roast it in fire and eat it, but you can, bang it you could crumble it on a rock and eat it, or you can, you're not allowed to crumble it on a rock and eat it, but you can crumble it in your hand. Presumably, this sweetens the fruit, and then eat it. So we see you're not allowed to have hay ba'or. It says you're not allowed to roast the fruit, whatever you're eating, in fire. So the Gemara says, Hasan again, mishum bit melacha. It's not because you're doing anything wrong, it's because you're wasting time on your job. You have to do this on your own free time. And hachinami mistabra, the isakadai mishum mituke pere, if the whole reason why is because you're not allowed to sweeten the fruit, and that's why you're not allowed to roast it in fire. Selamai mituke pere ika. What's the problem of smashing the fruit on a sela and crumbling it on a rock and eating it? You're not sweetening the fruit that way. You're just making it easier for you to eat. And says the Gemara, not true. He actually mimteke purta. If you bring your fruit on the rock, somehow it does sweeten it a little bit, brings something into the fruit and make it more edible. So that's not a proof. But anyway, we don't have a bright raya that you could be mehavhev bu'ur. So one more piece till here. Tashma.
They didn't have a union.
Yeah. Oh.
They didn't have a union this time.
Yeah. Well, so one more minute. If they're hoeing in figs, the goydrim tomorrow bites them by nova moiskim is they're cutting olives or cutting grapes. They're allowed to eat, and they're potter from mices. The Torah allows the worker to eat from those fruits. But pitam lo yaichlu, elam came not l'rishus balabayis. For the bread, they can't eat it. They cannot eat it with their bread, only if they get permission from the balabais. And here's the key: and they're not allowed to dip it in salt. So we see you're not allowed to dip it in salt, and therefore Gemara assumes that you're not allowed to roast it in fire either. You're not allowed to dip the fruit in salt, so because you're going to eat more, so you're certainly not allowed to prepare it in fire so that you'll eat more. So here's your proof. And says the Gemara, finally, melech vadai kanavim dava achadami. Salt is worse because salt is like eating the grapes with a relish, which allows you to eat more. So certainly you're not allowed to salt the fruit. But just without salt, without adding anything, just to roast it in fire so it'll become sweeter and you'll be able to eat more of the fruit, perhaps that would be permitted. So far the Gemara did not answer that question. I don't think the Gemara will. Okay, we'll stop over